Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us for today's session on land value capture, leveraging land for financing climate action. My name is Amy Cotter. I'm the Director of Climate Strategies for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. The Lincoln Institute is a private operating foundation that seeks to improve quality of life through the effective use, taxation, and stewardship of land. We're based in the United States and are currently celebrating our 75th anniversary. We join you all in seeing the climate changing in ways that is already severely affecting people and places, making this conference and its call for action all the more imperative. Cities do stand to bear some of the most significant impacts, and 70% of global cities already are. Some 90% of cities are coastal and therefore vulnerable to effects like sea level rise and coastal erosion. And a third of the world's population is already exposed to extreme heat of at least 35 degrees for 20 days or more per year. That's triple the number of people who experienced that kind of extreme heat in 1980. The impacts in cities stand only to increase, not only as climate change progresses, but as the world's population in urban areas is projected to grow from 55 to 68% of global population by 2050. As we all know, the costs of stemming climate change and adapting to its impacts is extraordinary. Now, cities do stand to bear some of the most significant impacts, but they also present a context in which land values could be captured to help pay for necessary investments. Today, I'm joined by Enrique Silva, Mateo Schlecker, and Ruben Werton, and all of you to explore ways in which land can be leveraged to finance climate action. Following presentations by Enrique and Mateo, I'll invite you to participate in discussion with your experiences and questions. Then we'll hear thoughts from Ruben and wrap up. Now, contrary to other Daring Cities sessions, we are using Microsoft Teams. So let me give you a quick orientation. On our desktops, you will see an array of icons in the upper tray to the right. Clicking on the thought bubble icon will open a chat window for you to see links to our bios, for example, and to interact and access other resources that are posted by my colleagues. Clicking on the hand and smiley face icon will allow you to raise your hand. That tells us that you wish to speak, and we will unmute and turn on your camera to facilitate that. With that, I will turn it to my colleague Enrique to open the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, and I will be uploading my presentation. And it's there. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. My name is Enrique Silva. I'm the Director of International Initiatives at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and I'm so happy to be here with our colleagues from the OECD and GIZ. I'm setting the foundations of our conversations on the role or the potential role of land value capture and climate adaptation in cities. I'll be talking a bit about the core principles of land value capture and raise some questions that I hope we have a chance to discuss. My core argument is basically right here in this one slide. Climate adaptation in many ways cannot go ahead without the participation of local governments and municipalities. And within that, and for that participation to be effective, these municipalities, these local governments need to be fiscally sound. That means that they need to have a capacity to pay for services, a capacity also to generate and collect revenues that then can go back into the services and projects that are needed in order to adapt to climate change. The other part of my argument is that land, which is probably one of the few resources that municipalities actually do control, is a largely untapped financial resource for them. And this is important because land values are conditioned by government regulations, administrative acts, and investments, public investments. And that those investments and those regulations create land value increments that can be recovered by the public sector, the local government in this case, to further finance some of those interventions. And we'll talk about some of those key mechanisms over the course of the day, in particular charge for development rights, density increases, or payment for betterment and improvements. The key questions for us today are, are the public sector climate mitigation and adaptation projects or investments, are they triggering land value increments? And if they are, what land value capture tools could be applied so that we can actually finance those investments and continue to what would be a virtuous cycle of planning adaptation mechanisms and financing? So let me take a step back. What is land value capture? Land value capture is a policy approach that enables communities to recover and reinvest land value increases that result from public investments and government actions. You'll ask, what are we talking about by public investments and government actions? In terms of infrastructure improvements, rail, public transportation, roads, parks, open spaces, possibly conservation mechanisms or land conservations or water or ecosystem restoration. By other government actions, we're talking about zoning changes, planning and land use regulation policies and instruments, zoning, how much density can a piece of land sustain, what kind of uses could be placed in a particular piece of land. That's what we're talking about. How does urban land value increase? Property values, private property values increase primarily not for any action of the private property owners, but by public actions like infrastructure improvements, zoning changes that allow the types of uses that could go on the piece of land and the intensity of those uses. That's what creates land value for the property owners, and the increments there are what we want to have an eye on. What are some of the prominent value capture tools? We have impact fees, special assessments. The list is pretty large, and Mateo is going to go into a couple that we think are might be useful to think about in terms of climate adaptation projects and initiatives. Then we can also have an opportunity to talk about what land value capture tool to use in what context. This all really depends not only on what is triggering the value increment, but also whether or not the municipality has the legal authority or mechanisms to recover some of those increments and to what extent. Now, this is a very abbreviated presentation on land value capture, but if you were to do anything and if you're interested in value capture, you need to make an argument for it. And I want to give you 3 threads of arguments that you can make in favor of land value capture. First, it's a pragmatic approach to financing. Again, land is largely an untapped financial resource for municipalities. Most constitutions or local legal frameworks allow government to tap into those increments that are considered unearned income. And I can explain that later if you want to. And then again, land value increments can be captured to anticipate or recuperate public investments and supplement public revenues, such as a property tax or sales tax, or maybe other charges that you have. There's also an equity dimension to the arguments for value capture. Land value capture is very effective at distributing the burdens and benefits of planned urbanization. It allows for an equitable share of the pros and cons of densification or even urban extension. It's also an efficient tool and policy approach. It neutralizes the externalities of private land uses, and we can talk about that as well as we go into our conversation. It also allows for upfront charges like betterment levies or air rights that allow the government to recover or to actually collect the revenues that can then be invested to affect the policy change or the project that is desired. For the effects of our conversation today, what we want to pay attention to is that when we talk about value capture, we're not just, we can't just be stuck on the capture part. That we have to understand that when we even think of value capture, we're also thinking at the very beginning of value creation. Without value creation, we can't recover any value. And again, the question here is, are there public actions around climate, or are there climate adaptation, climate mitigation initiatives and investments that are generating uplifts in private property values? And if they are, how can governments look at those increments and deploy some of the value capture tools to recover that, to continue to finance those initiatives and investments or policies? And with that, I will leave it and pass the floor to Mateo, who will talk about a couple of value capture tools and then continue the conversation about where this could lead us and how creative we can be with financing some of the great initiatives and projects that we all have in mind at this conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Enrique, I will share my screen. Are you able to see it? Okay, Perfect. So my presentation will focus on practical examples of land value capture instruments that can be used for climate action. So I will present 3 instruments which are less often discussed in relation to climate: land readjustment, the infrastructure levy, and developer obligations. And perhaps I will focus only on 2 instruments, given that we don't have a lot of time. And for each instrument, I will first explain how it is implemented in practice in a selected country, and then show how it could be used for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. As Enrique explained, public actions can create value. So the idea of my presentation is to show how specific instruments can create value and how this value could be used for climate action. So the presentation is based on tentative findings from the OECD Lincoln Institute Global Compendium of Land Value Capture. It's a joint OECD Lincoln project, and GIZ contributed greatly to it. So with the compendium, we collected information on land value capture from 61 countries, and it's an important piece of work because currently most evidence on land value capture comes from individual case studies. So there is very little systematic information. So the compendium will be the first systematic and international overview of land value capture, and it will provide comparable information about land value capture instruments across countries. It will be published in early 2022. So now, let me now start with the first instrument that I will present. That's land readjustment in Israel. So what is land readjustment? Imagine that the government wants to develop an area like the one that is circled in red on your screen. So there is an irregular pattern of land plots, as you can see on the left pane of the slide. There is insufficient space for public infrastructure. You can see that the plots take up the whole area and there is no place for additional infrastructure. Or there could be a lack of funding or a lack of ability to expropriate private land. So it's basically very difficult to develop the area. So the basic principle of land readjustment is that in this situation, land plots are pooled together and readjusted into a different shape and size in an orderly configuration so that space is created for public improvements. So you can see on the right pane how the initial plots were readjusted, and the space that was created is in white in the right pane and in gray in the middle pane. So basically the boundaries of privately owned plots are redrawn and the ownership of some land is transferred to the government. In Israel, for example, as you can see in the middle pane, land that is transferred into public ownership is used to provide public streets, public utilities, parks, schools, etc. So after a land readjustment, 2 things happen. Landowners receive a smaller plot, so the area of plots decreases, is what you see with the green arrow. And you can also see in the right pane that the plots are smaller than the original ones. However, the value of the smaller plot is higher than the original plots because of the improvements that were made to the area. So that's the orange arrow. So the improvements made are the value creation aspect. They increase the value of land. And the value recovery aspect is that private land is transferred into public ownership. So so the space that is created, basically. In Israel, half and up to 70% of land readjustment areas are dedicated for public improvements, which is a very high share. But despite this large share, the remaining smaller plots are still much more valuable than the original plots because of Israel's high urban density and demand context. So land readjustment in Israel works well, and both landowners and local governments often view land readjustment as a win-win situation. But perhaps we can return to this later in the discussion if it's something of interest. So now, how can land readjustment be used for climate mitigation and adaptation? So for mitigation, we saw that land readjustment can create space. So for instance, land readjustment could be used to create space and finance cleaner mobility systems such as trams or metro lines. So you can imagine in this figure, in the middle pane, instead of having a street, you could have a tram line. So the plots would get smaller, but more valuable because of the tram line. Land readjustment could also create space for green spaces, parks, and trees, which sequester greenhouse gas emissions. And on the adaptation side, land readjustment could create space and finance flood risk reduction infrastructure and improve drainage systems to evacuate stormwater, for instance. And green spaces, parks, trees, or even a river or a canal flowing through a readjustment area helps reduce urban heat island effects and heat waves. So I will now move to the second instrument that I'm presenting, which is the infrastructure levy in Ecuador. It's called betterment contribution or betterment levy in some countries. The basic principle here is that the government builds a public improvement that benefits nearby plots of land, and the benefiting landowners have to contribute by paying a fee. So in Ecuador, for example, the improvements can be public roads, public transport, public utilities, or parks. So the value creation aspect is that a public improvement or infrastructure, so when you provide a new park, for example, raises nearby property values. And the value recovery aspect is that landowners pay a levy to cover the cost of public infrastructure. So in Ecuador, local governments charge the estimated total cost of public infrastructure to landowners. The tricky thing then is how to identify landowners who benefit from the improvement and are charged. Some countries charge landowners whose property increases in value thanks to the improvement. This means estimating the increase in value for each plot. In Ecuador, they use a simpler impact rule based on the type of public infrastructure. For example, so imagine that the black line that you're seeing is a street. So in Ecuador, for new public streets and sidewalks, adjacent properties are charged. So these are the properties that are circled in red on your screen. For sewer and water infrastructure, landowners whose plots directly access these public utilities are charged. So again, the properties circled in red in this case. And then for large projects, such as a tram line, all landowners in the municipality or entire neighborhoods are charged. So that would be the entire picture if you imagine that the brown line is a new tram line. And then, how much each benefiting landowners is charged is based on a formula. The formula, for example, takes into account the size, value, and distance to the improvement of benefiting properties. So the idea is basically that properties that are closer to the improvement benefit more, so they have to pay more. And local governments may grant exemptions based on socioeconomic characteristics of landowners. So the idea is that the instrument can also be distributed in a fair way in the neighborhood. In Ecuador, the infrastructure levy is widely used to finance public infrastructure, especially in the largest cities. So how can the infrastructure levy be used for climate mitigation and adaptation? So for mitigation, it could finance cleaner mobility systems again. So tramline, for instance. So a tramline increases the value of nearby plots, and benefiting landowners have to pay. It could also be used to finance green spaces, parks, and trees, which again sequester greenhouse gas emissions. It could be used to finance bike lanes. In large cities, house prices go up with bike lanes. Or it could be used to finance infrastructure for the energy transition. So, for instance, charging stations for electric vehicles. And then on the adaptation side, again, the infrastructure levy could be used to finance flood risk reduction infrastructure and improved drainage systems to evacuate stormwater. And then, I mean, green spaces, parks, and trees, as I already mentioned, help reduce urban heat island effects and heat waves. So maybe I can stop here. There are other instruments. I focused on two instruments that are less often discussed in relation to climate. There are also other instruments that could be used, for instance, developer obligations, special assessments, impact fees, transfer of development rights, or strategic land management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matteo. Thank you, Enrique. And perhaps some of those other elements will come up in our discussion, which we'd like to launch into right now with a quick poll to get a sense of who's in the room, so to speak. So I wonder if we could queue up the poll, please. There we go. Do you have any previous knowledge on land value capture before today's event? If you could please click the button that most corresponds to your answer. I think we've received responses from most of the participants. If we could reveal the answers.
I will read them to you, Amy. Apologies.
All right.
39% have said yes, 36% have said somewhat, and 25% have indicated no.
Excellent. And that's a very interesting, fairly even spread. Thank you very much. Shall we move to the next poll? Did you already participate in the implementation of land value capture instruments? This is trying to get a sense of what experience is out there that we want to learn about, perhaps we're not already aware of. If you could please provide your answer. All right. Thank you, Joe from ICLEI, for helping us with the polls. And when you feel you're ready to share the results, that would be wonderful.
Sure. We've had 15% have indicated yes, but it had nothing to do with climate action, while the other 85% have indicated no.
Okay. All right. So significant interest, but not yet personal involvement. So for the proportion of you who did have some experience with land value capture tools, we are very interested in learning what those cases are. And yep, Joe, if you could please put up that slide, please. Thank you. So what are those other cases, particularly, well, I guess most of you said you've been involved, but not related to climate. Are there any other cases in which you may have some familiarity, even if not involved yourself, where land value capture is implemented to finance climate action? Or can you think of opportunities for that to occur, where land value capture may be an appropriate mechanism to leverage that value increase and help to finance either a given piece of infrastructure extension that helps to create that land value uplift, or an additional public investment at a later time? We're going to use the chat to get your answers to this, and this is a good time to also remind you that the icon with the hand and the smiley face gives you access to the raise hand feature. And that's how you let us know that you're interested in contributing something to the discussion. Any experience with other cases of land value capture mechanisms being used directly in relation to climate action? We learned that nobody has personal direct experience, but knowledge would be we need to learn about as many cases as we can. And I also wonder whether, again, there are examples where you think they could benefit from land value capture tools. All right, got a bunch of people who are interested in learning. And please, if you can think of examples as we go through the discussion, don't hesitate to volunteer them as we go. But I think that we're going to proceed with our discussion. We've got some good time for discussion, so please don't hesitate to weigh in. But I wonder, Enrique, Matteo, you raised some questions for me as somebody who's interested in marshaling as much resources as possible to help pay for climate adaptation and mitigation activities. I described in my opening a world that's already affected by climate change, as we all know. And it strikes me that the land value capture mechanisms depend on there being an increase in value from the investment made. And I wonder whether that also is an opportunity available when the investment really just forestalls a decline in value. I wonder if you could offer some thoughts on how, because I regard things like investing in flood risk reduction infrastructure, does that increase the value of properties or does it forestall a decline in value of properties? And is that a consideration as we think about these tools?
Thanks, Amy. That's a great question, and it's almost kind of existential in that we're trying to figure out what is the value and what is what's the increment. I think if the intervention is showing an increase in the value, it's showing an increase in the value, and that's the legitimate object of recovery. Whether it's forestalling a decline, it doesn't. You won't see the decline because you're seeing the already, it's the value appreciation, again, you're recovering that. Whether the intervention actually doesn't, if it doesn't have an effect on the risk on the property, is another issue, and it's about the intervention and the policy intervention, but it's not necessarily, technically affecting whether or not there's an increment related to the intervention and that could then be recovered. The other thing to consider is that it's not just about, and one of the things I hopefully would get across is that it's not just about an investment, but it's about how we zone and regulate our land uses. And I think that's important to consider. And so my question to the audience and to our colleagues that are deep in climate action, what are the land use tools and the ways of rethinking land use regulation that go hand in hand with some of the objectives that we're trying to pursue, some of the ways that we're trying to reshape, reform cities? To what extent are we embracing, or do we need to embrace density? And if that's the case, that's a land use trigger that immediately values, in order to kind of, for whatever reason, we're promoting density or more compact cities. I think it's, I don't want to lose sight of that dimension of the discussion that we're having. And again, the conversation from our perspective is where, how are we affecting, or are we doing anything that implicates changes in land use regulation? And if they are, let's talk about the value, if there's a value creation component there. And usually with density there is, and if there is, then that's an open opportunity for generating revenues based on those increments.
No, thank you. Matteo, Ruben, anything you'd like to offer or in response?
Well, not directly, but I think I have like a similar question in mind, and that is, I don't know if Matteo, maybe you can answer something, but from your practical experience, how is the value actually calculated? Because I was thinking, taking a prominent example from Germany, supposedly you are transforming on-street parking space into bicycle lanes. From a pretty subjective point of view, some people might view that as an increase in their property value because it's an increase in the quality of the infrastructure. Some others with a different political belief might say, okay, that is a decrease in the quality of the infrastructure, and thereby I'm expecting the value of my property to decrease. So what methods are used to evaluate the value of property? Because I know, if I'm not mistaken, in Germany, it's quite difficult to have an assessment of the actual property value, and to reassess is sometimes met with resistance, because you run the risk of having a decrease in your property value assessed. So how do you tackle this practically?
Good questions.
Yes, so I mean, how I would say that how property is valued depends on two things. I mean, on each country. I think each country uses a different valuation systems that takes into account different characteristics and has a different formula and different approaches. And then it also depends on the instrument that is being used. So, for instance, the example that I took with the infrastructure levy in Ecuador. So one way to assess what landowners have to pay would be to appraise the land values because of the improvements made. But that's something that is very difficult to do, as you pointed out. And that's why they use another approach, which is based on the cost of the improvement as opposed to the increase that it creates in land values. And they use this simple impact rule to identify landowners that are going to be charged. And then it's a formula basically that based on different criteria, the distance of landowners from the improvement, the size of their property, their socioeconomic characteristics that determines how much they have to pay. And I mean, I've seen that some countries, when they had in place instruments that were taking into account the increase in land values, they actually found that it was very difficult to apply, and so they went for the infrastructure levy at least back to they went back to estimating and not estimating the value, but just distributing the cost and using a formula, and then it depends on other instruments. So for other instruments, I was thinking of developer obligations. It can be based. They can be basically included in the planning system. So there are just simple rules that are applied when a developer wants to build a new development, and according to a formula or according to a negotiation, he has to provide certain things. So some instruments don't need an appraisal of land values. And when countries actually use the value approach, then it would depend on how each country goes about it. So for instance, I know that in Israel regarding charges for development rights, the way they did it is they created a list of highly certified and trained real estate appraisers. And whenever there is an improvement, they go to these kind of people to estimate the increase in values, and then they can interact with landowners if there is resistance by landowners. So that's to say that it depends on the instrument, and then it depends on how each country values its land.
Mm-hmm. You raise an interesting point by simply referring to the country. The country sort of may do it differently, but I'm also, I think the vast majority of land use decisions are at least somewhat in local control. And so is land value capture necessarily established at a country level and then implemented through local governments, or is it feasible for a municipal jurisdiction to set the rules and establish a land value capture regime for itself?
Sure.
Enrique, you want to?
Yeah, no,
So
I think it depends. I mean, I think what we're finding through the compendium is that for the most part, there is a hierarchy and there is a basic need to look at the national constitutional level, but that's not a full requirement. It doesn't, if it's not in the Constitution, it does, but then you start seeing further down different dispositions that allow the jurisdictions to deploy some of these tools. For the most part, in most countries, the basic legal disposition that opens the opportunity for value capture is, the basic rule that you can't have unearned income, that your income needs to be, and if it's unearned, then that needs to be that gets recovered. But it does matter. It does vary. in many cases, municipalities have a control over the property tax. If they have control over the property tax, then they probably also have other opportunities to raise other types of levies and charges. And land value capture is not a tax for the most part. It's a recovery. It's a charge that comes that is being requested, it's being brought back into public coffers. The property tax is a land value capture mechanism to the extent that it is tracking the increases in value. So if the rate is capturing, or it's set up in such a way that is the assessed value is updated, and that update is capturing the increases in the property value, then the property tax is theoretically taking some of that increase out, but it's what's called an indirect land value capture. But I want to go back to a point that Ruben mentioned about, and I think if I understood you correctly, this people's perceptions of whether or not an intervention is raising or not. In a sense, from the land value capture perspective, it's neutral to people's perceptions. The market and the transactions and the sales will tell you whether or not the intervention or the investment had an effect on it, which is why it's so important to have a good eye and understanding of how land markets work in a particular jurisdiction or in a local area. Land markets are very localized. And then there are models, we often use hedonic models to kind of really isolate the relationship between the investment and all of the other factors that go into the value of a land and the property on it.
That's helpful. Matteo, Ruben, anybody in our audience, you're welcome to chime in. Matteo, I think you unmuted yourself to offer something.
Yes, I mean, about your question, I mean, it's many of these instruments are used at the local level. So it's local governments that are in charge of implementing them, using them. So in some cases, they follow some higher level legislation at the national level or at the state level, but then they have some discretion on how they use these instruments. So that brings the question of administrative capacity, which is central to using land value capture instruments. So administrative capacity is very important because many of these instruments require these, technical calculations on how to apply the instruments, which landowners should be charged, the increase in land values. So that's a very important aspect. And I mean, going back to the example of Israel, because these things are so difficult are difficult and technical to do, one solution, for instance, with Israel is to appoint these appraisers at the national level that local governments can then go to if they have to calculate the increase in land values. So that's to give an example, but many of these instruments are used by local governments and municipalities.
Well, that strikes me as very helpful. I mean, certainly in the United States, there are many instances where a city government is more interested in taking dramatic climate action than is the state or national government. And I could see that being the case in many other places as well. And so to the extent that this presents a mechanism for raising revenue sort of by the municipality within its control, that strikes me as quite almost freeing from a sort of political standpoint. Are you seeing examples of that being the case? Whether the value capture instruments are being used for climate action or otherwise? I guess my question may be a little convoluted, but it fundamentally, it does strike me as advantageous that a municipality could have substantial control over this revenue raising mechanism, and that strikes me as an asset of it. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts along those lines. Enrique?
I'm actually a little bit unclear on what the question is. So they have the assets, but how do we get to them having the assets through the recovery?
I am thinking of asset in a less tangible sense, forgive me. That giving municipalities a mechanism to raise revenue without depending on a national government to do more than, and allow it, strikes me as advantageous for the municipality.
Oh.
It's advantageous, an asset in that sense.
No, very, very much so, especially if the national government or higher level of governments are either hostile or indifferent to types of actions that local governments understand that are needed for their community. That principle of subsidiarity is in play here. Is like the local government has a best sense of what is going on in the city, in their jurisdiction, in their environment, and so forth. And to the extent that they have the relative autonomy or some autonomy to both plan and then through the planning find ways to generate and recover or generate revenue, then they have that room to be more creative, be more to take some risk necessarily with some projects that they wouldn't have if they were completely dependent on funding streams that were external transfers, for example, and so forth. Mm-hmm. I saw in the chat there was a question about can land value capture be used as a planning tool? It's a really good question, and I think that the very key thing here to remember we're talking right now of a fiscal tool, a revenue generating, a revenue raising tool that works well when it's thought about and integrated into planning. And so it's very, very important, and this I'm speaking as a planner, not an urban economist here, that the starting point in the creativity is the planning. How are we planning our cities? How do we want to plan our cities? And then through that, think about how that planning action, whether it's planning for the projects, investment projects, or again, rezoning and so forth, how are those generating or impacting land values? And if they are, you have fiscal tools, land value capture tools that you can use in order to recover that increment. The tool itself isn't going to do the planning for you. That idea has to come beforehand. And so they have to go hand in hand. And oftentimes the planning doesn't contemplate the effects on the landmark is positive or negative necessarily, and it definitely they're not often coordinated with the economic the budget or the budget planning or capital plannings or even or even just the CFOs, the chief financial officers of cities, to think about how to coordinate planning action with fiscal goals and revenue generation and revenue distribution.
It's very. As a planner myself, I appreciate that. And I want to apologize. I did not scroll down in the chat, and I see that there were comments and questions that I was unaware of. And one of them, if I could bring it in, Esther mentions the clear importance of stakeholder consultation to I think in the Ecuador case, for example, talking about working even directly one-on-one with landowners who may be reluctant or sort of resist paying their share. And I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit on the importance of that, what that looks like, what your experience is with the approach that's best.
Joe, do you want to take a crack?
Yes, yes.
I can keep on going, but go ahead. I just gapped.
Yeah. Yes, it's a good question. I mean, many of these instruments are implemented by consulting landowners. So, for instance, land readjustment, if you take examples in Asia, in Japan, or South Korea, there are hundreds of meetings sometimes per project between local governments, developers, landowners, and other stakeholders until a consensus is reached about how to organize the project. So that's something that is done a lot for land readjustment, but also other tools. So for betterment contributions, landowners are very often consulted. For other instruments, like if you take developer obligations, developers also have a real say in what the project is going to be and what they have to contribute to. And I mean, with developer obligations, the obligations are often actually negotiated between local governments and developers. So there is really a back and forth between both parties until they reach an agreement about what the developer has to provide, for instance, in a new development or densification project. So yeah, there are many of these kind of consultations and negotiations going on.
Mm-hmm. Which strike me as the kind of engagement, the level of engagement that often is required to do good land use planning from the get-go, and yet another reason to incorporate thinking about land value capture in concert with planning. I want to bring just two questions from the chat into our conversation, and then I think we'll turn it over to Ruben to give him fair warning for some wrap-up thoughts on our discussion. One of the questions is just an observation that land value capture does seem to have significant potential, and an inquiry about the state of its use globally, whether there's an advanced usage in certain contexts, whether they are different in an urban-rural continuum or north-south context. And then a request for some commentary on what are the potential risks associated with land value capture. So I'll open that to any of you to offer your thoughts. Enrique, you're unmuted, so I'm going to call on you.
Sure. Thanks. These are great questions. So the state of land value capture, and I think again, not to one of the reasons that we're doing the compendium is I think it's on the upswing. Land value capture mechanisms have existed for years. Colombia is celebrating 100 years of its betterment contributions. So it's not a new mechanism, but there is increased attention and interest in it, in part because the bill for urban development or the bill for climate action is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so where is that revenue coming from? And as I mentioned, for the most part, land-based financing or land-based revenues that can come from land value captures are largely untapped. We're depending a lot on government transfers, grants, and so forth. There's another whole pool out there that needs to be considered, and I think that's where the interest is coming in. One of the risks, and I think one of the, but I'm going to flip it around. So the challenges for applying value capture, and this goes to the stakeholder question, is that the mechanism implies a certain limit on property, on private property and property rights. It's claiming a particular value on property rights. So in jurisdictions or in communities where property rights and the value of property is seen as something that is completely on the owner, it's an acquired right of the property owner, the logic and the legitimacy of land value capture is very, very difficult to sell. And so that is one of the barriers. And so the primary stakeholders that you have in order to get effective land value captures are the property owners, and they could be hundreds and thousands, millions of different fragmented, or in some places very monopolized and concentrated. And it not necessarily meant the development sector. So there are two different stakeholders there. But again, the risk here is really, can you tap it into it in a place where there is a legitimate political claim to recover that earned income that the public is claiming as theirs? I think that's one of them. And then other types of barriers or risks is that, the issues kind of going back to Ruben's point, figuring out the value of property or value in general is not a science, it's an art. And how we value things is really, really risky. And some of the risks are that you can overstep or you can either grab too much or not grab enough with the value because you just don't have the mechanisms to figure out what the value is. And then from there, what the increments might be of the action that you're claiming is triggering the increments. And those are some of the challenges. The other bigger challenge is that people just don't know about this. So there's this, as one of my colleagues at Martin Smolko is one of the experts, world experts on this. One of the biggest barriers for promoting value capture is sheer ignorance. We don't know. And even within cities, we don't know that this is something that we can actually act on and connect with planning practice.
Thank you, Enrique, and hopefully we're helping to address that final point through conversations like this. Matteo, I'm going to invite you to offer any thoughts in reaction to those questions, anything else in the chat, and then we'll turn it over to Ruben to wrap up for us.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think Enrique covered many points, and what we are starting to see with the initial findings from the compendium is that, as Enrique mentioned, there's a big variability across countries. So some countries are implementing these instruments since 100 years, while others have not heard about them. So there are some countries where, you know, they don't even call it necessarily land value capture, but it's integrated into their planning system. So developer obligations, for instance, they're not called in this way with this particular name, or they're not defined as a land value capture instruments, but they are in the planning system. So whenever developers have to build a new project or densify private property, they have to contribute. So that's in the planning system, and they're applying it since many, many years. In other countries, they haven't heard about the instruments, so there is a huge potential. And then regarding some of the obstacles, Enrique mentioned already quite a few. Another one that I mentioned before is the lack of administrative capacity, which is important. And then the lack of a legal framework. That goes together with not knowing about the instruments, but some countries know about the instruments, but they don't have a legal framework. So in Mexico, for instance, the absence of a legal framework at the state level often hampers the use of instruments at the municipal level. So that's another interesting aspect. So although there is national legislation, if the legal framework is absent at the state level, then municipalities are not able to use the instruments. So that's another. The legal framework seems to be a very important aspect according to the first findings from the compendium.
Mm-hmm. Will people who are interested in exploring the potential for land value capture in their city be able to learn more about the legal frameworks for their country from the compendium? Is that the kind of information that they'll be able to learn from there? That's great. Well, I join you, I know, all in looking forward to seeing the compendium in the spring of 2022, I believe. I'm going to ask Ruben to offer some thoughts from the BMZ perspective on this discussion, on these mechanisms and their potential for climate action to sort of wrap us up and bring us home, so to speak.
Thanks, Amy. And I just realized that right now the spotlight did turn back to me. At least for me, it was stuck on Enrique for the past 15 minutes. I had the feeling, Enrique, that at a certain point you felt a bit uneasy about that fact, but from what I see, it's now turned on me, so thanks for that. Yes, although I did speak before, nevertheless, good afternoon to everybody, to you and in the audience. And first of all, a big thanks to Matteo and Enrique for your presentations and your elaborations in the discussion. That was quite insightful. And of course, Amy, big thanks to you for the wonderful moderation. And I have to say, although I have been involved with the study that you referred to today repeatedly over the past, well, almost a year now, the event today was quite insightful for me. As you probably know, our pragmatic approach as German Development Corporation is the implementation of global development and climate goals, as well as to achieve these goals within cities. So, not surprisingly, currently around 30% of the German technical assistance and more than 50% of our financial cooperation is linked to cities. Linked to cities means it is taking place in cities or addressing urban needs, or working with partners at the national level that are responsible for urban and or territorial issues. The programs are mainly related to decentralization, municipal service delivery, and infrastructure development, for instance, water and sanitation infrastructure. Globally, even if we succeed in limiting global warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius that were agreed with the Paris Agreement, cities nevertheless will continue to face significant impacts of climate change. And to protect people and infrastructure, they must increase their resilience. Among other topics, the German Development Cooperation focuses therefore on climate-sensitive planning and sustainable water management. And by strengthening public partners, we support the implementation of the Agenda 2030 in cities. Along urban development processes, financial and economic efficiency, equal opportunities, and social justice, as well as environmental sustainability, have to be permanently negotiated and reconciled. I think we've already tapped into this issue a little bit in our discussion today, but it's much broader, right? Cities have a huge convening power to bring together different stakeholders to contribute to these same objectives while combining their collective resources and capacities. Thus, key success factors for urban development from our perspective are stakeholder involvement, accountability and transparency, as well as trust, reliability, and credibility. So good governance really is a key success factor for us. Hence, our support to partner countries puts equal focus on sound urban governance and urban management and on financing urban development. Within this framework, land value capture has, from our perspective, the potential to improve the effectiveness of the German Development Corporation's programs, because fiscally sound municipalities are key for urban resilience as well as for climate action. And this again links to what we discussed earlier, right? There was the question, land value capture is the opportunity to give municipalities additional fiscal space. And I think almost all countries in the world are set up in a way that the fiscal autonomy of municipalities isn't very broad. So having this additional source of financing really increases the headroom for action on a municipal level. Land value capture thereby contributes to a better financial performance of subnational authorities, but also to improve governance performance in terms of transparency, equity, and inclusion. As pragmatic, equitable, and efficient mechanism for financing climate action, land value capture instruments offer a huge opportunity to harvest the potential of land as a financial resource for municipalities. In order to successfully implement land value capture measures, the right national urban development policies and land policies need to be in place, as we've heard earlier. And at the subnational level, a proper mandate, adequate resources, and of course, practical and multidisciplinary education and training of public professionals are essential. Additionally, continuous spatial and market monitoring, we've said it earlier, it's more an art than a science, is essential to monitor and evaluate land value increases, captures, and returns. Ensuring that those success factors are in place doesn't only benefit climate action, but, as we've also said earlier, all dimensions of sustainable urban development. So to sum up, land value capture approaches for climate action shall be considered as part of a process where the way they are implemented is as much important as the results. So having it transparent and participatory is as important as getting good funds generated and have a good influence on urban development in the end. And obviously, land value capture cannot be a standalone measure. I think, Enrique, you emphasized that earlier. But it has to be a component of a strategy for advancing adaptation and mitigation objectives alongside public finance and social equity objectives. The examples that we talked about today from around the world show that cities are often pioneers in the development of innovative instruments. And we also saw there isn't one solution that fits all. Some instruments are better adapted to specific contexts or purposes. On the other hand, climate action is urgent. So tools and approaches to implement it meaningfully are crucial for all our future. So I close with saying that I hope today's event was a motivation to all of us, to all of you, to have the courage to experiment with this instrument of land value capture, to adapt it for context-specific solutions, maybe based on local or traditional good practices? Well, it certainly has for me. I leave there and really would like to thank everybody participating today for being here, and very much looking forward to hopefully continue this discussion with all of you and putting it into action in the future.
Well said, Ruben. Thank you very much. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Mateo. Thank you, everybody. And special thanks to our ICLEI partners who have produced this session. Let's continue the conversation. I think we all see great potential. Thank you very much.